Welcome to the Practical Spirituality series. The purpose of this series is to share what I have read and learned about how your spirituality can function in everyday life. I like to call it practical spirituality. My goal is to give you some ideas on things like how to acknowledge conflicts and deal with them, how to let negative thoughts wash off of you, and how we attract the right people to associate with. I'm going to review systems that are used for this purpose as well as individual practices. I hope these insights prove beneficial to you and your family. All right, again, good to see you. We're going to go on to the session number 3, and one of the things I wanted to do is just kind of double back. Some of you might note by now that I haven't done a whole lot of talking about theology in the church, and part of the reason for that was when I was, when this was happening for me, when I was going back and looking at places where there was good spirituality, unfortunately, I wasn't finding much in the church. In other words, church was really more about religion. It was more about outside-in kind of thinking that if you're a good person and all the rest, and then God will bless you. And there just wasn't really very much good spirituality at the time, and some would probably make the case there's still not. In other words, to fully understand grace, it has to be something that is unconditional. That's the whole point of the cross, and so that this is something that God has already done. So trying to find places where it was occurring was difficult. And so that's a part of the thinking here, is really just to begin to identify by how grace works. So in terms of core concepts, all the authors that we've talked about so far, we're tapping into that idea of this innate wisdom, if you know, this innate thing that was happening within people. So Bradshaw, he talks about, right from the start, he just says that children are natural born Zen masters. And they have this, they just basically go through the world, and what happened to children somewhere along the way is they got the mixed messages or the wrong messages, and so he's really big on going back and recapturing that. And he's a therapist, so he's going to go through it in that manner, and he has this whole books and books on the inner child and how to go back and find the inner child. That was a really big buzzword back in the 80s. But the thinking there again is that there was something, it was almost paradise lost, that we started off and we came into the world intending to have this child that was fully to blossom. Bradshaw actually quotes a woman named Alice Miller and says, every child needs to be exposed to 18 months. All we need is 18 months of unconditional love. And if you get that, you'll probably be pretty healthy. And which goes to show you how kind of sad that is, that it's just a very difficult thing, clearly, because he was saying on the other hand that 96% of families were not healthy. So, but again, this is a space that we came into the world and we already had this thing that somehow was taken away from us. Covey, talks about the personality ethic versus the character ethic. So Covey's contention there is that we were all imbued with this natural character, and when we stay close to these natural gifts we have, that we will exhibit this and be a different kind of person than if we don't. But again, the whole thing was you didn't earn it. It was just given to you at birth, that you have this character within you. Friedman says that we all have this capacity for non-anxiousness. And so it's just that there is within us all the time this place that is peaceful, like a quiet pond that's always there. And so our ability, if you will, to go back and reconnect with that is the difference. And he uses it in leadership, but also in families or any place else. When we can connect with that place that just doesn't have anxiety, that has the capacity to be in the midst of something and not be swayed by it. And that was the basis for all of his teaching was non-anxiousness. And then Goldman, he talks about it from a different angle between the cognitive brain and the emotional brain. And when these two things kind of come together, we have this emotional intelligence, which is an intelligence that surpasses or transcends whatever we're in. But again, all those are innate. They're not anything that we earn. The last one, Goldman would say that you can condition yourself and be better at it, but you're not going to be deeper at it. It's something that's already within you. The other one then that is this power of choice. In other words, if we have this innate wisdom, then we also have this capacity to choose it or not choose it. And they were all big on that. And so again, Bradshaw, all of our choices depend on our views of ourselves. He would go back and say, every decision we're making is reflecting who we are. So again, the more healthy we get internally, the better choices we're going to make. And so it's all about tapping back into that. Covey, of course, this was from his book, but that gap between stimulus and response. So he just, that was a huge one where he just says there is this moment in any given situation where there is choice. And it was just this great statement that he has a chapter on. And so, again, he goes on to say the way we see the problem is the problem. So it's the way we see something is the issue. So again, that's all about, again, this free will or choice that we have. And then Friedman would say the non-anxious part is the presence part. We have a choice to stay in the midst of something and to be present to it. So that's the choice we're making, is actually to be in it. But again, the important part here is that these were all minor parts of each one of these authors. It wasn't the main thrust. So my point is, it's almost like that parable of the man who's plowing a field and he stumbles across buried treasure. They all hit this, but it's almost like they stumbled across it and they didn't maybe even know what they had, because it was there in their literature, especially in Bradshaw's literature, but he never really wrote a book around it. Covey has a chapter on the whole idea of paradigm shift, but it's not, again, the main focus of it. Friedman, the same thing. He talks about the non-anxious presence, but then goes on to talk about more leadership issues. So in each case, they stumble across it, but it was not the main thrust, but it was buried in there, and so you could find it if you look for it. But again, it wasn't the first thing out, that was through the door. And then finally, this last part is emotional intelligence. A whole point there about the 70,000 thoughts per day, and we have a choice in which ones that we hold on to. And again, but not the main thrust of emotional intelligence either, and they call that self-regulation, this capacity we have to regulate or to figure out what choice we're going to make. Today I want to talk a bit about moods, because that really kind of sets the stage for this next transition. And what was happening was there was more and more work being done around the idea of moods, and not bad moods or good moods, but what I would say is low moods and high moods. So this was out of emotional intelligence, that people in good moods, bless you, are better inductive reasoning, creative problem solving. So again, that might sound pretty obvious, but there really wasn't any literature before this whole point about the place of, if you're in a good space and you're in a high mood, you're going to be more productive. There just was no research up to emotional intelligence that talked about that in any way or form. It was more like you just plow through your day. But they were the first ones to begin to talk about that. The thing about moods, and this is a quote from George Pransky, and it was a really great one, it's like, we don't know why moods change. All the evidence we've done, they just do. They just, sometimes, you wake up in the morning, we wake up at night, we have all different kinds of places where we can be low or high. There's some research done about kind of rhythms of a day, where we'll kind of go like this during a day, but we don't really know why moods come and go, they just do. And so anything that talks about trying to manage moods is probably not going to go very well. It's not about trying to get out of a mood. It's just more about just letting it go by, going back to those 70,000 thoughts. When one comes through that you don't like, it's like a sign. You just leave it alone and don't spend a whole lot of time with it. But there was no sense of trying to make this thing happen. But the mood work was really about this idea that they just shift. When they shift, they shift. So again, it's not about good or bad. It's like the weather, it's just more of it comes and it goes. But it's more of low and high, not good and bad. But there was no sense of I'm in a bad mood. That was not what we're talking about here. It's really more about how you view something, that you can look at a situation depending on your day or depending on your mood, if you will, and you'll see things differently. So again, it's not controlling, it's just your responses to the mood is the most important part. How you respond to a mood is more important than trying to control it. We're not trying to get out of a low mood into a high mood. We're just really not spending a whole lot of time fueling a mood that doesn't work for us. So this is a quote again from George Pransky. He says, we may respond to our low moods differently. We all experience them in similar ways. So these are some of the aspects of what a mood looks like. a negative mood. They're automatic. They are not actually arrived at on the basis of reason or logic. They just seem to happen. If you really wanted to look at a perfect example of how moods work, is watch a child when one moment they can say, "I hate you," and then the next, and then 30 seconds later you can go, "Mom," they can just like turn around on a second, and they just come and they go. And so the whole point is we get older in life, is learning how not to respond to them, to go ahead and let them pass. They're like internal weather. We've talked about that one. They often the thoughts are unreasonable and unrealistic, and they serve no purpose. And oftentimes moods are like that. They're unreasonable. In other words, anyone who's ever had that time where you woke up late at night and there's something that seems like it's really pressing and really important, and then when you wake up in the morning and you look at it again, you think, what was I thinking? That was just terrible. It was just bad thought, but that's the way they usually are. They're unreasonable and unrealistic. The problem is, and this is the important part, they seem reasonable and correct to us at the time. In other words, there's something about the brain, whether we, and I don't know enough about psychology or whatever else, or ego, but there's something about the brain that thinks that this is reasonable, that this is a good idea. And I've mentioned before in my story about I used to live 2 houses down from the church when I was in Redondo Beach, and I would wake up sometimes, young father trying to get a lot done, new to being a rector. I get up and think I can't go back to sleep, and I'd be in a low mood, and brain would just be going, so I'm just going to go do some writing. And I'd walk over 2 houses down, get in my office, and write a letter to the parish on something, and then come back and take a nap in the middle of the day because I was exhausted from writing at 3 and 4 in the morning. And I'd look at the letter and say, who wrote this garbage? Because it was just terrible, just really bad stuff. But at the time, it seemed like it was genius. It was just great. And so the concept, and everyone's done that. We call it in our culture putting your foot in your mouth. But this idea is that we say things or we give fuel to things. And at some point, just understanding that that's part of the deal is how to regulate those. Pransky says the only trick in life is to be grateful for your highs and graceful in your lows. So that's really the trick, is to be, when you have a higher mood, to be grateful for it and appreciate it. And when you're a lower one, just be graceful. Don't give it any energy. And again, if you're in a low mood, he says you keep your mouth shut, pay no attention to your thoughts because they're untrustworthy. I have a guy I knew one time, and he was in the 12-step program, and he has this great statement, and I've used it before, but he said, my mind is like a dangerous neighborhood. I don't go in there by myself, and that's just a great way to remember that. Our minds are odd. They're very odd. And I think that opening prayer we say to God on behalf of a congregation, which we say, to whom all thoughts are known, no secrets are hid. In other words, God gets this. That's all right, but it's just accepting this for who we are, but understanding that if any of us had to write down the things that we thought, we can all, I think, pretty much admit it could get pretty ugly. We've all been in spaces and in foul moods where it's just amazing what we can generate, amazing what I can generate. I'll speak for myself and just go, wow, that was really awful. And that's okay. It's just let it go, and just giving yourself permission not to fuel it. Again, and turn the attention from your experience towards its source, from the created to the source of the creation. What that means is this. Oftentimes in a low mood, we're oftentimes participating in blame or something else. We're saying the reason I'm in this space is because of person, event, or whatever else. And understanding that probably is not true. So it's practicing this art of being able to turn the attention not from the situation that we're upset with, but back to see what's generating it, because usually the source is going to be more important than the situation. So it's not that the situation, there are those once in a million situations that are just awful, but for the rest of them, oftentimes where we are, where we're coming from, how we're looking at something is much more essential than the actual issue. So practicing that and learning how just to come back and say, where am I? And emotional intelligence, that's the whole basis for it, really, is learning how to be able to do that, to call self-regulation, where we just take a step back and go, I'm gonna withdraw from this. There was characteristics of low moves. He says, this is the other things that happen. Mental activity or thinking velocity increases. For whatever reason, the brain gets heated up. It keeps going. It says, if that doesn't work, that this is working. And so it'll just go and go and go, which again is why oftentimes you can be in the middle of sleeping, you wake up, be in a low mood, and it's hard to get back to sleep because the brain is, the intensity is going on. It wants to think its way out of something, almost if you've ever seen a dog chase its tail. It just wants to keep going, and if it just runs faster, it'll catch its tail, and it's not going to work. And so just understanding, I need to chill out. It was a great word that we used to use when I was a kid, and it actually makes a lot of sense, that actually the brain does heat up. It wants to keep going. It adds more activity to it. Second thing was our thinking gravitates to problems and dissatisfactions, and so you'll see over and over again in a low mood, it'll go from one thing I don't like to the next thing. I don't like my job, I don't like my car, I don't like my dog, I don't like my house. It just will keep on that level. These guys, Pransky and these guys talk about it's almost like being down in a basement, or he even talks about the fact of an elevator, that your thinking is like that, and depending on where you are in a moment, it's like an elevator that goes up or down. In a really high mood, it's going to have a different view and it's up here. And when it gets into a low mood, it's going to be same brain, same building, all the rest. It's just where you are and just understanding what floor you're on. Are you on a top floor or are you on a low floor? A heightened distorted sense of immediacy. We think we must do something right away. So not only does the brain heat up, but we need to get this taken care of now. There's that great statement that Paul makes about do not let the sun go down in your anger. And I used to try. Have you ever tried to practice that? There are some times you probably just should let the sun go down in your anger. You know what I'm saying? In other words, early in my marriage, sometimes we need to talk about this before we go to sleep. And looking back, it's like, dumbest thing in the world. Maybe we just go to sleep and we'll talk about it in the morning because it just never went well. Conversations after 9 o'clock at night on something that was bugging us. I can't think of a time where that was a good conversation. It was usually just turned into something awful and you wake up in the morning and go, what was that? But again, this idea of the immediacy, we need to get this solved. I can't tell you how many bad decisions I've made just by making decisions. You need to make it right now, and I do that. And now I have this thing with Linda I just built in where she'll come in and ask me a question, and she just knows he's not going to make a decision right now. And sometimes I just don't know. I'm not self-aware at that moment, so I don't know if I'm in a good space or a bad space, so I'll just say, give me a half hour, and then let me just think about this for a minute and ponder. There's nothing wrong. There's very few issues in our lives that we have to make a decision right away. We're not driving 80 miles an hour in a freeway. It's sitting in an office or someplace where it's like, you know what? I can just take a moment here. We feel self-conscious. It seems that we are at the center of everybody's attention. There's something about low moods that over and over again, for whatever reason, we feel self-conscious. That everyone's looking at me, all that kind of thing. And why is that? But again, Pransky says that oftentimes, for whatever reason, it becomes all about the spotlight's on us. A pessimistic outlook, and again, limitations and are blind to possibilities. In low moods, all the work that the emotional intelligence people did said that same thing, that in a lower mood, we just don't have access to possibilities. It's just, it's very much of a black and white, I need to do this. Well, what about this other thing? Well, can't do that. It's not part of the equation. Again, and then they overgeneralize. You hear these words over and over again in low moods. You always, you never. There's just that sense of just overgeneralizing. Like, really? Do I always do that? Every fight usually has one of these kinds of phrases. The fight with a loved one has, or someone you care about, one of those kind of phrases where you always do this. It's like, really? And rarely is it true. But at that moment, that's what it feels like. And then the final one is bad thinking begats bad thinking. In other words, it just will continue on. You make one bad decision and you stay in that space and it's almost like they just multiply. They will just go and go. And there really is no limit, in one of those spaces. And so at some point it's just pulling the plug. And that's why all these people in this field would agree. You just let it go. You don't try to spend any time with it. Don't give it any energy. You don't have to change it. You just don't have to do anything about it. So a case for a meditation or an adult timeout. Meditation for me was something that I didn't never really do very well. Maybe it's just my ADD riddled brain or whatever else, but the idea of sitting and all the rest. But so what I started thinking, what helped me was just to call it an adult timeout. Just once you understand that we have this innate, if you will, peace that passes all understanding within you, then you don't really need to do all that much. And that's the whole point of the labyrinth. At the end of the day, people say, well, I did a lot of research in the labyrinth, like where it came from and how to do it and all the rest of it. Are there special ways? And there's a little bit of stuff out here and there, but it's way too complicated. All you're doing is just giving the cognitive brain something to fixate on so that this other intelligence within you will rise up. That's all you're trying to do. So any kind of activity that you can do just to put a stop to things, and you will automatically will find yourself, being able to access a greater center of wisdom and all. So it's really not about going ahead and spending that too much time. If people are telling you that meditation is very complicated, then it's too much. It really is just about rediscovering what you already have. So again, anytime that we meditate, anytime we do a timeout, the first thing we're doing is we're not getting caught up in thoughts and man-made activities. So right away, whenever you pause for a moment, you are not doing that. So by virtue of doing something where you're taking a walk or whatever it is, you're not doing something else. That alone is going to be very helpful. Studies of those who participate in mental workouts reveal healthy brain circuitry is strengthened. So anytime that you have any kind of routine where you're doing something that causes you to make a different choice, you are actually increasing the circuitry. So you're not that you're going to get deeper, but you are going to get better at avoiding these rough spots, if you will. There's a big study called the Tetris brain. And what they did was they took these teenage girls, and they took a bunch of them. I don't know why it's girls, but Tetris is that game where the blocks kind of come down and they basically hit spots and you're trying to build this whole Tetris wall. Well, the way the Tetris brain worked was they did studies and they had these teenagers play the game for an hour to an hour and a half a day. And so what they noticed over the course of time is that they used less brain energy and got better at the game. In other words, the brain developed its own circuitry, so they could actually, over the course of time, no matter the puzzle, be much better at it without exuding as much energy. And that the brain does this. The brain has this capacity to form its own circuits. And so what we're doing is anytime you put some kind of routine in your life, or you have a walk, you do whatever it is you do, you are creating circuitry that's going to be helpful. And so anything. And so to the point where the created space allows us to see reality clearly without the filters that the mind adds. And there's a Scandinavian study that just came out in January, and where participants took lunchtime walks. And so they gathered all these people and they said, look, we want you to walk for a half hour in the middle of your day. And the people who did this just it wasn't life-changing, but yet it was. In other words, they just were a lot better at things. They got way better at things. And so they were more enthusiastic, less intense, and more relaxed, just by having a pause. And that's all, again, this is all this innate energy, if you will, that we have within us, that it's always there, and it's just a matter of doing anything to reconnect with it. So anything that you do, any kind of routine that you can put into your life, doesn't have to be complicated. It shouldn't be complicated. You're not trying to be complicated. Ultimately, all you're trying to do is just to stop potentially what might be happening. And so until, because there are plenty of times where we might not be self-aware. In other words, there's nothing worse than thinking you're in a good space and you're not. Have you ever been there where you think this is really good, I was in a great space, and then you realize, uh-oh. And so all you're doing by putting some kind of walk or anything you do in a day is going ahead and just making sure. So it's a space to stop and pause. So summary on this part then. Again, just like we said, moods, they come and they go. Because a sense of well-being is innate, we just really don't need to do a whole lot to connect with it. You just don't. And that's probably the biggest thing I see in terms of spirituality is that people talk about, this you have to be a theologian. I hear all the time people say, I don't know enough about the Bible. And you know what? That's okay. Ultimately, everyone's been given this innate spirituality, that we talk about in the scriptures called grace. It's already there. You don't have to do a lot. It's just connecting with something that you already have. It's an unconditional gift. In other words, it's already been given to you. Every person here has grace, you see. And so what I like to say, or what friends of mine like to say, is that the grace is always in you. You might not always be in the grace, but the whole point is it's always there. It's not something you have to generate. It's always going to be there. The redefinition of bad moods, I think that's a great spot. It's just to get out of the whole idea of bad and good and just understand low and high. And low moods are not necessarily bad. They just, if you leave them alone, they'll be fine. And then this idea of a change of heart. When we are insecure, and our thoughts quiet down, we get in touch with our deepest creative powers and moments. They are the key to resolving difficulties and problems. This quote comes from George Pransky, and his contention was, he wrote a pretty, arrogant might be a harsh word, but he wrote an article back in the early 90s that basically said he could fix any marriage. And his whole contention was this whole idea. His contention was, he and his wife were therapists, and they used to do a lot of therapy and going back and working on people's problems. And he was practicing that with his wife, and his marriage was going into the ditch. And so he went on this retreat with this guy we're going to talk about next week, named Sidney Banks. And when he did this, Banks' whole deal was just going back and rediscovering a change of heart. Just to go back and what I try to tell people, and you've heard this before in terms of marriages, is there was a time where we were so in love with this person that we were willing to stand in front of all kinds of people and all the rest of that, and there was something there, and it never went away. There are, and again, there's always that marriage that I'm not talking about the exception, but for the most part, it's still there, and it's just going back and having a change of heart. So all of their therapy was they called it non-cognitive therapy. All their therapy was about going back and working on change of heart. And when people had a change of heart, they understood each other, and they listened, and they did all the things that healthy people do, and they were just transformative. And so these people go on these retreats. They were paying like $3,000 to go on a retreat, but still, if you think about the amount of months of therapy you'd pay anyway, it's not very much. But they would go on these retreats. He'd teach them how to do a change of heart. They work on it, and they'd have incredible results. And so that's where that whole idea is. So again, not just about our marriages, but just about working on change of heart, just as we're going along, of going back and getting in touch with this thing that's always in us. It never goes away, and the only thing we can do is, again, be graceful in the low ones, and be gracious and have gratitude in the high ones. All right, thank you very much. I want to try to put everything together next week in terms of just connecting them with the spirituality part, and we will get more biblical next time. But this one here is, just to practice that concept of letting them come and go, and understanding that idea of self-regulating. Don't fuel things that aren't good. It's just bad thought. There's plenty of it. Again, when you start being a little more forgiving, I guess, of yourself, you think about it, we've got 70,000 thoughts a day. There's going to be ones every day. You're going to have some that you're just going to want to just get rid of. And don't fuel them, and let them go. All right, thank you very much.